Okay, thank you everyone for joining us again. Now we'll go to part two. Many of you know, but the speaker for part two is also my minister's assistant in Salt Lake and also my wife. Her main job is she is a psychiatrist. She went to medical school in the Philippines, where she's from, did her residency and all her board certifications at Ohio State. And then she also attended IBS for a while to get her Shin Buddhist certificate. So she's received her Tokudo and is currently working to get her Kyoshi with the group coming up in October. And she has been, since we met, she was originally, before she was Catholic, from a very, very Catholic family, where her older brother was a Catholic priest, her older sister was a nun. And so it was very Catholic. But it wasn't me who took her to hell, for her family, if they're watching. She was Zen Buddhist before she was Jodo Shinshu. And so when we met, she'd never been exposed to Shinshu, but we talk about sometimes the way she does therapy, and I've seen how it's changed quite a bit from because there's Zen counseling, there's Tibetan Buddhist counseling, but I don't know too much about a Shin-centered type therapy. And so she's been doing that quite a bit in her own practice. So I thought it would be interesting to see how Shinjin and Shinshu has affected the way she does therapy. So turn the time over to her.
Thank you, Sensei. I just say I'm in the three subordinations of women in the Buddhist tradition with all those hats. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Thank you so much for being here and investigating what's going on. I call my talk the therapeutic process that happens in the space called Shinjin, the Buddha's heart and mind. And basically there's three major contents in this talk. One is I'm gonna show you my mind, okay, which I've never really talked much about before. So that in itself is a paradigm shift from the way psychotherapy is conducted in classical training. I kind of refer to it as the idiot's guide through darkness. It's what my mind looks like. And then this paradigm shift, as you can see in this slide, the first slide. Don't see the slide. Oh. Yeah. It is the Nigabyakudo, right? The wide path between the two rivers of fire, the fire of anger, and the water of greed. And when you come to this point, what we call the point of three deaths, on the lower part of the slide is where essentially people come to see a psychiatrist in the moment of crisis, the crisis of three deaths, right? Spiritual crisis, mental health crisis, life crisis, all represented by the beasts and bandits and nowhere to go. But for me, what really stands out is the white path, because that's the Nembutsu path that I could show them without saying as much, but at least it's one way, like a leap of faith, to be able to put their crisis in perspective. But the most significant part about this white path for me is the concept of ondobo, ondogyo by Shinran, fellow travelers. not an expert to a patient, but really just one human being with another, just walking this white path together. So in my mind, it's a definite shift from the traditional model of practicing medicine, where the physician is the person of authority and the patient is the human being that receives, maybe even passively, the services of the physician who's assumed to be an expert. That's not really my thinking anymore, especially with studying Shinjin. I'm the crazy one. And I call myself a mental health professional. And I'm working with real people with real suffering and real challenges in their lives. So completely turned me on my head. Because it's kind of more of an egalitarian, collaborative space, I feel like it allows my patients to feel more open with what pain and suffering they're carrying with them. So it's almost like they share with me their most intimate parts of themselves that they won't even dare to share with their spouses or their loved ones because it's just too painful or too heavy or too embarrassing. There's a lot of shame, there's a lot of guilt that comes with their crisis. And it takes an incredible amount of ego strength for them to even decide to see a psychiatrist, because there's a lot of stigma, right, with mental health. Maybe less so now with COVID, when the country essentially was in a mental health crisis. And the crisis there, I think, has to do with the isolation and disconnection that we've had with each other, the suspiciousness that breeds hostility, right? And just really outright rage. It's me versus you. It's your virus versus my health and well-being, which really puts us stuck in this dualistic thinking of quote unquote good and bad, right? Illness and wellness, which is also the mind trap. So for me, talking about Shinjin kind of opens up that space where if we could see ourselves as real human beings who are limited, who are imperfect, who are subject to so many wounds in this life, which comes back to noble truth number one, right? You can't go through this life without getting chipped or cracked. I mean, that's the reality that we need to learn to live with. Is sort of the theme, or at least the space that we can now talk about the difficulties that they encounter in their lives and sort of minimize that sense of shame and guilt that you're just who you are because you're a human being. And this is what it means to be a real human being. So it's looking at authenticity itself, the vulnerability itself as a human being. The third point about this talk is that my work, when I really look at it, I've been a psychiatrist now for, maybe 40 years now. I started training in 1984. Oh my gosh, that's ancient. Yeah, 40 years, but the first 20 of those was this mindset of, the God complex, right? That's kind of how we were trained. It's all about jiriki, self-power. I can help you. I can prescribe for you. I am a healer. And then looking back 20 years since I encountered the Nembutsu, it's like, nothing could be more wrong. I don't know anything. So my job essentially is doing nothing and not knowing anything. Which in a way is really easy because all of the healing and all of the transformation is the work of Hongan, the 18th power, Tariki, other power. All I need to do is to just bring myself, my bamboo, but also sort of this understanding that when people are in crisis, it's temporary, it's impermanence, right? This too shall pass. It shall pass like a kidney stone, but it shall pass. But also even more profound than that is coming back to how my work is being made easy for me by Amida Buddha, by theraputic itself. I could see how, in front of me, right before my very eyes, how wisdom and compassion just unfolds. So it's absolutely amazing. Next slide, please. So this is a review of the 18th vow. If, when I attain Buddhahood, the sentient beings in the 10 quarters who, with sincere and entrusting heart, aspire to be born in my land and say my name, and underline those, even 10 times, should not be born there, may I not attain the perfect enlightenment. Excluded are those who commit the 5 grave offenses and those who slander the right Dharma. So for me, what stands out here, the 3 minds of Amida Buddha: sincere and trusting and aspiring. And I need you to remember that we're not talking about me here. We're talking about therapy itself and how it plays out in a therapeutic setting. And saying the name, that's my practice. That's what I do. To say the name of Amida in my mind or out loud. Some of my patients have actually been introduced to Namo Amida Butsu itself, and it creates a lot of deep discussions from then on. But saying the name is just for me, because I need to be constantly reminded that this is really the work of Amida, and I'm just here to participate like a fellow traveler, right? Like a Sherpa or something, a donkey, a baggage carrier or something like that, or a wheelie, a wheelbarrow, something. Okay, so just so we can get through that white path. Okay. So the issue at heart here, when it comes to the 18th vow, is without the sincerity and the trustworthiness and the aspiration of Amida Buddha, what happens in a human being's tortured mind is invalidation of their own suffering. It's minimizing the wound, because that's also a survival response. If you come back to the first noble truth, we survive everything, every bad thing that happens to us, just so we can keep going, right? And so this invalidation, this denial of, which is also an ego defense, creates that deep wound that we need to dive into in order to really understand it, and also to allow the healing light, if you will, of Amida to get there and heal it. The invalidation of one's suffering in the healing process through the compassion of Amida Buddha, the condemnation of oneself and others, or falling for the untruths that contradict the experience in one's own life, need to be processed and examined and looked into, but with this energy of curious compassion, if you will. So I have to go in there not knowing anything, because if I know something already, then I've already made up my mind, I've already made my judgments, which is, I think, just stupid. Okay, so not knowing is very good. Next slide, please. So we come to the wheel of samsara. You're familiar with this tanka. It's Tibetan tanka. They call it the wheel of life also, or the wheel of becoming. One of my favorite therapeutic metaphors. It shows this demon, Yama, which is the demon of impermanence, clutching the wheel of samsara, birth and death. So we just kind of go around and around and around in these different mind states that I call mood swings. So in this sense, when people are feeling threatened by, say, a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, I just have to tell them the universe is bipolar. Night and day, right? Cold and hot. It's always, happy hour somewhere, but who's to say who's right and who's wrong, that sort of thing. So the bottom half are the hell realms. So from left to right would be the hungry ghosts. And then the very bottom would be beings in hell, all kinds of hell. And if you Google Buddhist hells, man, they're really graphic and really painful to look at. I mean, traumatizing, very painful to look at. And then the one on the right in the bottom would be the animal realm, or the realm of anger, of survival. And then the top three are your fighting demons on the left. So these are people with powers who can literally destroy each other, right? And then the top one is your heavenly beings, the ones who are just kind of out of touch with reality. And then on the right would be the realm of human beings, which is the only path that anyone needs to go through in order to be enlightened. So to become a real human being is the key to being able to access this wisdom and compassion of Amida, in the sense that there's now this potential for liberation, okay, salvation from suffering. If you notice, all of these realms also has a bodhisattva in each one of them, which basically means that compassion does not discriminate among the different states of existence. Next slide, please. So we're familiar with Bono. That's at the center of this wheel. There's three animals. There's the pig, the rooster, or a bird, a red bird, black pig, red rooster, and a green snake. And they represent our Bono. Okay, so the pig is the ignorance. I don't know why, because maybe they're just happy eating, they don't care. The rooster, it represents our attachments, our passions. And then the snake represents aversion or anger. And you notice that they're all biting each other's tail because they're all interconnected. So they're hurting each other as they go. This, in my mind, ties into evolutionary biology. We are all genetically wired in our DNA to have greed, anger, and ignorance. And that's for survival. We always have to be on the lookout for threats and danger. So greed, anger, and ignorance, in my mind, are not wrong in that sense, in any sort of moral or religious sense, but they're just painful to have around. Anger is painful. Craving is painful. Not knowing is painful. One common theme is not knowing what happens after we die. That's painful for a lot of people. So again, it comes back to this appreciation of how painful it could be to be a human being, and how it doesn't have to always be that way. So the self-deprecation is a common theme. Sort of this throwing yourself under the, it's a self-criticism, self-hatred. It's really, really toxic. From a Western perspective, they refer to that as the inner critic. But if we view that from the lens of Shinjin, it's awakening to the true and real nature of being human, of being vulnerable, of being limited, imperfect. And also how, if you look at the big picture, the Tanka, there's the Buddha there showing the way. So Buddha is there, Buddha nature is there, and human nature is there. They coexist. Next slide, please. that's an inside look in my office. I have kanon everywhere because I forget. I have to be constantly reminded that this is a space where I need to listen to the cries of the world. And I have the attention span of a fly, so I have to be constantly reminded that the one on the right is my Butsudan, and that's in back of me when I see patients by telehealth. And I like to think, Kanon Bodhisattva has my back. Okay. I even have a Buddha in the bathroom. And it's a candle holder. Next slide, please. So the essence, I think, of Shinjin itself, and they talk about this, right, in our doctrinal materials about deep hearing. And it's listening with our entire self, right? It's not discriminatory hearing, if you will. So when we're chanting, for example, we're listening. We're listening to ourselves and everybody sort of as a group, a unified group. Momyo, hearing the name, is what I need to ground myself in so that I could hear what's going on in my office. For me, it also means hearing the Buddha's primal vow to save all beings. And in this case, it's both me and my patient, which, brings me back to the point, my work is really easy because all I need to do is listen to all the juicy stuff that they bring to my office, but really not knowing anything, not knowing enough to judge it, as you shouldn't be doing this or you can't do that, but really more of a just allowing actually my patients to hear themselves as well, to deeply hear themselves, which I think is already a therapeutic element in the whole process. Because when they speak out loud, they're showing me what's in their minds. And I think about the three actions of Buddhists, right? The actions of the mind, speech, and the body. So when they're all there, they're bringing their entire human selves into this arena. Then they get to hear their own stories, their own narratives. And then it's almost like bringing those stories into the light. Then we can examine them together. One analogy, one therapeutic metaphor I like is to bring their backpacks with them, their baggage. And when they get in my office, just dump it right here. Just dump it on the floor. Let's see what you got. Next slide, please. So, Monku, Monku, Monku. That's the fun part, isn't it? The medical model, okay? When you're first interviewing a patient, the first thing you ask is chief complaints. That's in the progress notes, okay? Subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. That's the structure. So you look specifically for complaints because our medical system is so biased towards illness. We don't want to hear about how well you're doing. We want to hear what kind of big doo-doo you're in, so we can like zoom in on it and figure out what to do. So yeah, there's a lot of monku, 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 which basically points to the wounds themselves. So for me, complaining is, I should say, an act of awareness, maybe? Or listening to the self as well. It brings things to light that maybe they hadn't realized before. So we go through their themes and their narratives, and one trauma therapist would say, our trauma comes from the lies we tell ourselves, which I thought was really profound. And the reason that we tell lies is because we really truly believe that what we think is true. And that's the ego-centered perspective, which in itself is a stuckness, right? That we need to deal with and kind of work with them and get less self-attached, which is hard when they've been traumatized. The content also covers those disowned, broken, condemned pieces of the self. Again, the self-hatred is very poisonous. That's what drives people to suicide. The self-hatred, okay? I'm a burden to my family. I'm no good. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. okay? I'm broken. So the ego is broken into pieces and fragmented. A lot of my patients come from the fundamentalistic religions, and I understand that, having been born and raised Catholic. There are rules you have to follow, you have to be good, right? So there's all these requirements in order to be considered a part of that religious community. And the fragmentation of the ego is all about selectively choosing how they present themselves in public. Jungians would call that their persona. They have to have a certain persona of acceptability and belonging. They have to fulfill behavioral requirements in order to be a part of the community. So at the same time, those traumatized pieces of themselves never see the light. They're kind of put away and hidden, secrets, right? They don't belong. They're not worthy, okay, to be embraced and put in the big picture too. So oftentimes people will come feeling like there's something missing, or there's a hole, an emptiness. Kind of feels like that. So I have a sign, maybe swearing will help, because they're not allowed to swear. But I tell them, yeah, you can swear as much as you want, okay? Just don't let children hear you. Or don't take it home. But you could practice your all you want. Because for me, swearing is also an acknowledgement of this pain, of this suffering that they've encountered, right? And coming back to the healing part, I think, of Shinjin, is that when people listen to their own pain, they start incorporating, acknowledging, recognizing those parts of themselves that start to come home, if you will, to this fragmented self. And then they become heard, and when they're heard, they're more validated. And validation, I mean, is that it's true, it really happened. That what's true and real experience for them are also brought into the light. And that in itself is quite healing. Also, I want to say that this fragmentation of the ego is also a survival response. They have to break those pieces off just so they can belong. One teacher I heard is that the most painful sickness is homesickness, being homeless, not belonging, disconnection. And that's why during COVID, everybody was traumatized in some way. And of course, then they ran into a shortage of certain medications like ADHD, because people were going stir crazy. They didn't know that part of themselves until they were sequestered inside those four walls, and it was torture. So essentially, the self-hatred is sort of like that prison too, where people get trapped in their own thoughts and they go around and around in this wheel of samsara, and it becomes a very desperate place of crisis with no one there. Next slide, please. So I call it marinating in the mud, for lack of a better term. A lot of times we just kind of sit there, with their monku monku monku. Like every week, it's monku monku monku. For years, sometimes, months, years. It's like rehashing and maybe putting a little bit more of a cognitive shift every time they retell that story. So in my mind, it's about cultivating the courage also, and the inner strength, the strength of the human being to be able to reveal those hidden parts of themselves very gradually, which I kind of see as how Shinjin works. It's like the light hits the lotus root in the bottom of the pond where it's dark, right? At some point, the light hits the tuber of the lotus flower, and then it just kind of responds, right, to the light. It starts growing up and through the muddy water, and then it kind of breaks into the surface of this, the epiphany or the realization or some sort of psychological shift, which also makes me think of Hongan Namo Amida Butsu as Jinin, the naturalness, the way things are, this reality of the coexistence of suffering and non-suffering becomes clearer, as they get more into the muddy water, If you don't agitate it too much, it becomes clear, right? And people start developing sort of this insight into their situation. And again, this Thich Nhat Hanh, no mud, no lotus, to me is sort of the dynamic between jiriki and tariki being inseparable. In other words, our traumas become the object of Amida's compassion. In other words, if there's no pain, there's no trauma, there's no human suffering, compassion has nothing to do, has no purpose. But then again, if it's just suffering, there's no compassion, then it just really sucks. And where do you go with that? So when we talk about entrusting, that really requires sort of a non-dualistic view of dualism itself, up to a point, because ultimately we go back to this dualistic experience of what it just feels to be like to be miserable, but also kind of with that knowing that when there's a wound there, healing is there. I mean, there's no point in healing if there's no wound, right? If you cut your finger, our bodies are already built in to have these healing elements to it, and the bleeding stops and the pain goes away, right? And new skin comes in. That sort of thing. That's, for me, that's Jinan too. And you can expand it into the universe itself and how there's a balance. There's always this ethic of compassion to balance the unbalanced. And some of my geeky people would say, oh yeah, it's the balance between the energy of gravity and electromagnetism, right? So gravity pulls everything into entropy, and electromagnetism keeps the planets in their own space so they don't collide, right? Or the North and South Pole. They're opposing forces, but yet, because of those two opposing forces, we have an atmosphere, right? So we don't get burned to a crisp by the sun. See, that's really cool. All right. So the darkness of the mud is kind of where they suffer the most, because they really cannot see with clarity anything at all. This is where arrogance comes in, right? I'm absolutely right. It is really dark in here and it really sucks in here. There's an entitlement that comes with that, maybe as a way of proving how right they are. But these are also survival responses. Everything that we really do as human beings are meant to survive. It's encoded in our DNA because we don't want to perish, right? This is all about eventually being so self-centered as we want to live this life, but at the same time, it's so miserable. It's like, where do we go from here? That sort of thing. And then you get to Liga Byakudo, right? The white path, the 3 points. Yeah, it's amazing how that kind of works out. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite images of Amida Buddha. I think it comes from the Zenkiji temple in Kyoto. It's Amida Buddha looking back, making sure no one is left behind. Which for me is, one of the manifestations of, well, in real life, really, this statue, this sculpture of Namo Amida Butsu, taking refuge. So I like refuge because in many ways, we are trying to find a safe space. And that's kind of where all the Kanon Bodhisattva statues come. It needs to be a safe space so people can just be themselves and reconnect with themselves. So that means that in the framework of Shinjin, there cannot be condemnation. There cannot be preconceptions. it's the pure and sincere mind of Amida, right? That's kind of the position that my Bombu self is trying to take, and that's where I struggle because I'm judgmental and I'm critical. That's how I was trained. So it's like I have my own inner battles. Okay, I know what your diagnosis is, and I know exactly what medications you need to take. And then there's another part of me that's like, let's just like I hear this out, see where this goes, you know. So it's that's a struggle. But ultimately, the safe space has to be non-dualistically dual, in the sense that any condemnation, right? There's no condemnation for condemnation itself. There's no rejection of rejection itself. There's no judging of the judging itself. Does that kind of make sense? Makes you crazy, huh? It makes me crazy. So I have to be careful with this word entrusting because the cultural and religious context that I work in, entrusting is loaded because it goes totally against the grain of trauma. Trauma is loss of trust, this betrayal, it's abandonment. I cannot count on anything, not even my mom, to take care of me. In fact, I am abused instead of being taken care of. That's sort of the darkest place where they come from. So entrusting is a little bit tricky. I have to go more with the refugee version instead of the entrusting version. But in my mind, I'm the one entrusting in this process, okay? But maybe how entrusting manifests itself in the clinical setting is that they come to their appointments, right? They're compliant with treatment. It's like, ooh, maybe they're getting something out of it as well, right? Sometimes I have to ask them, what are you getting out of it? And they go, oh, it's just nice to be heard and understood. So in that sense, they're starting to feel connected instead of isolated and abandoned. Makes me think of sesshu, right? Grasp never to be abandoned. That sort of energy kind of emerging, okay? Oftentimes people really believe what they think, huh? You probably do that too. There's sometimes a lot of dissonance between what people think about and what reality really is. So this dissonance I call, disinformation or misinformation, right? The lies we tell ourselves. This is, I think, the heart of cognitive behavior therapy. Let's examine your thoughts and see how it reflects in your reality. And when they see that dissonance, right? It's like the light is breaking. It's like, oh, okay. It's like the metaphor there is like eating an imaginary hamburger versus eating a real hamburger. It's like, what would you do? Of course, hamburgers is not a good thing to eat, but anyway. So one thing about this interesting too is that on my part, there has to be this trustworthiness that I have to earn with my patients, meaning that I show up. If they're showing up, I show up, right? Which I can't always do because things get in the way, like viruses and that sort of thing. But in psychoanalytic terms, they call it object constancy, which is the basis of empathy in the development of babies. Okay, baby cries, mother shows up to comfort, right? To take care of, to feed, to rock, all of that stuff. Which makes me think about Amida Buddha, right? Oyasama, always there, right? But it's so abstract in that it's really hard to put into practice, like in real terms, especially when they've been abused as children and neglected. So that's kind of loaded too. It's really a struggle to like address that eventually. But anyway, the whole idea here about entrusting ultimately and bringing it into the present is just showing up for each other. We show up for each other, right? We are fellow seekers here, okay? You and I are not any different in that sense. Your suffering is my suffering, right? And my suffering is your suffering, which brings me to another paradigm shift, which is becoming a Jodo Shinju priest means I have to disclose my own stuff, which is totally against my classical training. It's like my ego is supposed to disappear, but in the Shinshu tradition and in the lens of Shinjin, I have to tell them all the troubles that I've caused and all the, my notoriety, that sort of thing, just so they kind of have a sense of connection. And I do have like one incident that I'm particularly, even proud to share, and that is my citation for disorderly conduct in a parking lot. But anyway, that's a different talk. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this brings me to Shinran's Kyogyo Shinshu and his reflection, right? And about how Shinjin is attained from the heart and mind of Amida Buddha. It's directed to us, okay? And that is what the true mind is, that is untainted by Bono, okay? So it's the mind that is unobstructed by lies and ego fragmentation and stories and narratives and all of that. But also, like Sensei Kohara said, it's loaded with virtue, right? The great medicine. Next slide, please. So yeah, psychotherapy literally means healing the mind with Shinjin, the great medicine. But what that requires is exposing the wound to this healing light of compassion. It's becoming vulnerable all over again, but in a different way. And the context here is a sense of safety and being heard and being accepted for who you are as a real human being. So it's not about DSM-5 and diagnosis and treatment plan, it goes beyond the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, 5th version, okay? All the labeling is misleading. So sometimes they come and I go, my name is such and such and I'm bipolar. It's like, well, where's the real human being? Are you just your bipolar or are you more than that? Okay, so anyway, the presentation to me is that ultimately they come to see a psychiatrist, not so much to gain, well, I give my 2 cents, of course, right? That's what they pay me the bucks for, but it's really about seeking the truth, looking for the truth, what's real in their lives, as opposed to looking to be diagnosed and treated. Okay, so it's a different way of thinking. But what this requires is deep diving, right? It's going beneath the surface of all of the ego defenses that we as human beings also establish just so we don't get anywhere near the pain, which is too much to bear for a lot of people. So when they come, they come with this guilt, this indebtedness, this shame, but they also come with courage, okay, and vulnerability, and a willingness to look at themselves. It's all in there, and those need to be pointed out. And so I like this, excuse me, this idea of crisis as also an opportunity. I think Rahm Emanuel, he said, never let a crisis go to waste. In that sense, it comes back to how crisis is maybe also a form of compassion, if you will. It's breaking open the mind of delusion to you can see the reality of the situation, but it's not very nice. Kindness isn't always nice, sometimes you're like, bam, just hits you sidelines. Next slide, please. there are real brain changes with psychotherapy. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. So on the left, that brain is inflamed. That's the buzzword now, neuroinflammation, right? The brain's going, "Ah," right? Nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, paranoia, suspiciousness, anxiety, kind of this unsettling, very disturbing state of mind. And so when we talk about Shinjin, the nature of Shinjin, the nature of healing, the nature of Jinen, right? The healing process itself, the cortex, right? The thinking brain absorbs all of that information. So there's a lot of psychoeducation, really, kind of a lot of reframing about what a mental health crisis is. That's also an opportunity, right? To heal, to get to the wound. And then it calms the brain down, and all those yellow spots kind of become more green and blue, like cooler. The brain's cooler. Next slide, please. And then what happens is really interesting. This idea of Eshin, the turning of the heart. It's Jinen too. It's the heart naturally turns to the light, right? In the darkness. I mean, you've seen this with plants. Yeah? You put them in a box, there's a hole, right? The plant goes towards the light, which is so cool. Which to me is like this awakening of faith. Again, where I come from, faith is loaded, right? Because faith, from a different perspective, is obedience. It's unquestioning authority, the human organization of authority, not the teachings itself, but the human beings that populate that space. And so it's very toxic in many ways, because when they grow up in abusive families, they are told one thing, but they are treated in another way, which is really crazy making. It's very confusing. Like, what can you trust? So when they start to awaken to the reality of their lives without cutting it off or bashing it or criticizing it, then it kind of opens up their perspective now about getting to know for themselves what their reality is. So there's a kind of a conviction, that's aha moments, this epiphany that they start opening themselves up to, which is kind of a knowing, this noetic, this unknowing that they start to embrace. So that's kind of the process that I see, that shit happens, then Shinjin happens, and then shift happens. Next slide, please. Am I on time? Okay. This is one of my favorite metaphors, this Kintsugi, this Japanese form of pottery. So apparently they don't throw anything away, you know that, right? Japanese people don't throw anything away, especially when it's their favorite crockery, right? And so they keep these pieces and they mend them with gold. And then the resulting piece is way more profound and meaningful than its original form, where there were no chips. So it's the chips and the breaks themselves that transform this piece. And the healing with gold, to me, represents Amida's light of compassion. And Rumi, I love Rumi. He says the wound is where the light enters you. So yeah, people become aware of their vulnerability and how it's okay to be vulnerable. That it's not wrong. It's not morally wrong. There's nothing wrong with you. One of my patients would say, "Is it the day you're gonna fix me?" It's like, there's nothing to fix. And I am not a healer. I don't know the first thing about healing because I'm injured myself, so that's like misery loves company kind of thing. And then this sculpture piece is called Expansion. And the sculpture is, her name is Paige Bradley, and I just kind of accidentally came into this picture. I think somebody posted on Facebook one time, and it's really just stuck with me. But anyway, the story about this sculpture called Expansion is about her understanding of, quote unquote, the irony of containment, which makes me think about the toxic cultures that people grow in and grow up in, okay? I mean, it's not all toxic, mind you. There's also compassion there, but like Sensei was saying, it's kind of invisible. We don't really see it at work unless we really look for it. But anyway, just talking about the irony of containment and how we take the risk of shattering ourselves and disconnecting, so we could let go of our attachments that are no longer holding any meaning or relevance or truth in our present life, so that we can reconnect those pieces in a more meaningful, profound way. So this is what they refer to, the trauma experts call as parts therapy. We need all the parts, okay, that we need, we can mend together, because if there's a missing piece, there's gonna be a hole there. And the gold may not, keep it all together, so you gotta find your missing pieces, okay? So breaking, right? Breaking, breaking off, it's painful, but it also reveals the strengths that are also there. Again, it's back to this non-dualistic duality that I was talking about earlier. And ultimately, it's about being humbled by our brokenness, which to me is, the path to being able to entrust ourselves to Shinjin requires putting aside our own arrogance and be humbled by our experiences, humbled enough so we can be grateful. Because it's hard to be grateful when you're entitled, yeah? Or arrogant, right? There's a humbling first, okay? It puts us in our place that we are real human beings and you're gonna die. So live your life now. So the brokenness, in a way, kind of breaks through the delusion of perfection, right? The delusion of being intact. We're sensitive. We're easily hurt, right? It's real. We break, and it's okay. Okay. Well, it's not okay, but you know what I mean. It's okay to not be okay. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, it's the no one after that. I kind of reversed the two. Yep, that one. I love that. Okay, the rock says, one day someone is going to hug you so tight that all your broken pieces will stick back together. And to me, that's kind of what Anjin might feel like, is being put back together, all the broken pieces. I mean, there's no breaks in this one, but I really like the message. It's becoming whole again, but imperfect still. Yeah, with all the guilt, all the remorse, all the sins, all the, transgressions become one taste, right? Shinar talks about this one taste of our Bono with the ocean of compassion. So Anjin is this settlement of the mind that I guess is also what Shinjin is about, when we entrust ourselves to Amida's sincere and aspiring mind for us to be saved from ourselves. There's a settlement. You, Sensei, was talking about that sort of this reduction in anxiety, right? Kind of this sense of being secure or being taken care of. It's reassurance, right? We're still fearful, but not as fearful. There's a sense of protection there, a sense of safety, and really that's kind of enough, right, to get through. And then the last slide. Yeah, go back. Thank you. Gasho. Gasho. And for me, this is about the reconciliation with the self. Because when we look at our beads, right, these are the beads of Bono. These are the beads of our imperfection. But it's precisely the beads of our imperfection that joins us with the Buddha, right? Without these beads, there's nothing to join. Yep, there's nothing to connect with. So the whole idea here is I have to take the responsibility of living in the Nembutsu myself. Because traumatized people have a very good bullshit meter. They can tell if you're faking it. And this is kind of where self-disclosure also comes in, which is so hard. Like Dharma talks, I have to talk about my bumble self. That is so hard. Like, I don't like doing that. I don't like to be seen as, less of an expert, right? Yeah, so there's work. There's work here and there's work there. But it's all about working together, right? Instead of just prescribing. It's all about oneness, yeah? It's joining, it's reconnection. Makes me think of religion. Religion, the origin word of religion in Latin is re ligare. Ligare is like the root word for ligate or suture, right? String that binds together, and re is like doing it again. So it's reconnection with our true selves. That's kind of what Gasho means. To be grasped and never to be abandoned with the Nembutsu. Okay, thank you so much. That ends my talk. Namo Amida. Namo Amida. Namo Amida.